Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic of this top 10? Top 10 worst gimmicks revisited. And before we get into it, first this came to us as a suggestion from Ryan Hadley. Thank you, Ryan, for the suggestion. Secondly, I made the worst gimmicks video 10 years ago. You can actually go and find it. It's on my channel. I'll put a link in the description if you really want to watch it. I did watch it back. It's not the greatest video. The sound quality is horrible. The video quality is horrible. I did enjoy that it was at the time where I had a co-host and his name was Gary Rhodes, a really good friend of mine. Still to this day, he's a really good friend of mine. But with that being said, because I already did this 10 years ago, I went back and watched that to first make sure that enough of my opinions changed to make this compelling for anyone that watched that video. And I was shocked to see how different my views were. Part of it was that the first time it was a collaboration between the two of us, so something that I may have found really bad, he might not have found as bad. So in the aggregate, let's say I said something was the worst thing ever, but he thought it was fifth, it might come maybe third. Where this is purely my opinion. And I'm saying all of this because as I go through here, I am going to let you know where the gimmick originally fell on that top 10 from 10 years ago, or if it wasn't on the list at all. Some of this, again, is the combination of opinions. Some of it is my opinions on certain gimmicks have changed over the last decade. Some that I thought were really bad at the time, I've grown to appreciate. Some that I thought weren't as bad, I've come to dislike even more. Also, there's been 10 years of wrestling that's happened since then, so there's been a lot of other bad gimmicks that have come along. So some of them do make the list as well. With that being said, we're going in with number 10, the Nightmare Collect. Obviously, this wasn't on the first list because there wasn't an AEW at the time of the first list. AEW is very faction heavy. We got factions like the Jericho Appreciation Society, the Inner Circle, the Elite, the Dark Order, Death Triangle, House of Black. They're always willing to roll out a fact. However, in the early days, this was one of their early factions, and this was one of the early misses in AEW history. And I don't think it's the parts themselves, but the group altogether. And what I mean by that is if you separate it, I think Brandy Rhodes is very talented. I think her mic skills are really good. Her ring work, not as great, but she's passable. Mel Cervantes, I think she's fantastic. I think she's a fantastic wrestler. Luther, I think, is a good wrestler. He is past his prime. I think he was better back in his Japan time. And obviously, Awesome Kong, in my opinion, one of the greatest women wrestlers of all time. So I think that this is more the gimmick itself than the wrestlers involved. A bad gimmick, fortunately for us, they gave up on it rather quickly. If they didn't, they let it drag on, it probably would have been further down our list, but since it got a Mercy's killing, it only made it to number 10. I'll go from that, our number 9, the Ding Dongs. I don't know how the Ding Dongs weren't on our top 10 previously. I gotta believe, and this is no knock on Gary, that Gary just didn't think it was that bad, and I obviously did. The Ding Dongs to me were one of the things that you could point to in the early 90s when people would talk bad about WCW and how goofy it was. The Ding Dongs were one of those things they could point to. And I just thought the gimmick was silly. I mean, they basically look like Starman from the old NES pro wrestling game, but they had bells on them. It was weird. They had a bell they would ring in the corner. I didn't like it. I understand it was to try and bring in younger fans, to bring in little kids, but it just was bad. It's something that probably should have stayed on the cutting room floor, hence why it makes our list. I'll go from that, our number 8, Shorty G. Again, this is another one that wasn't on the original list, mostly because it happened after the original list. Shorty G is the worst part of what I consider a really good wrestler's career, who ever since then has tried to dig his way out of it. We had Chad Gable, who was building a reputation as being one of the great wrestlers in WWE, either by himself or with Alpha Academy, or American Alpha at the time. Alpha Academy is his new thing. Then we get him turned into Shorty G, which to me felt like an out of touch, weird Vince type thing where he just didn't like Gable because Gable was short, and hence something that Vince likes to do from time to time, point out the negatives and not highlight the positives of a wrestler. I just didn't like this. I'm glad that he got out of it and the Alpha Academy is starting to build his career back up, and They have been for a while, but you had the potential of ruining one of your great wrestlers by giving him this silly gimmick, and it definitely hurt his career in my opinion. I do think that Gable would be much further along, much more accomplished if this wasn't something that they ever did. Now going from that, our number 7, the Yeti. In the original list, the Yeti was number 6, which puts him right about where he is now. And this was again another very short-lived gimmick that had to send red flags right away as soon as he debuted in the wrapped in toilet paper mummy thing. And I think he went on, when he did it after that, he was in a ninja suit, which neither makes sense because the Yeti is a Bigfoot. It's not a mummy. This was during the hokiest of hokey Dungeon of Doom times, and I'm not a Dungeon of Doom hater. I think there was a lot of good within the Dungeon of Doom. I mean, Ming is great. Kevin Sullivan's great. I love Kamala. The Faces of Fear coming out of that. The Giant when he first came in. There was some good things with the Dungeon of Doom. But more often than not, they got overshadowed by stuff like the Yeti. Again, another one of those forgettable early 90s, mid-90s WCW gimmicks that's probably better left out of your rewatching history. It's just that bad. And it's not bad in a good way like the Shockmaster has grown to be, which, spoiler, Shockmaster was number 1 last time. He doesn't even make this list. I've grown to really respect the Shockmaster gimmick, and especially my personal thoughts on Fred Ottman, the guy behind it, probably have peppered that a little bit. But yeah, the Yeti, just another failure in WCW's early failures, hence why he's on the list. Going from that, our number 6, I'm going to have to tread seriously light. First, so I could keep my monetization. Secondly, there's a very thin line here that I'm going to have to tread with how I explain this, and you'll understand here in a moment. Our number 6 is Orlando Jordan in TNA. And Orlando Jordan in TNA played a bisexual character. Now, on its own, that is not a problem. If he would have played it like Anthony Bowens does today, who I know he's not bisexual, but he is a gay person, and nobody cares. Matter of fact, when it was used just a few weeks ago, the fans were cheering for him being gay against the heel who was a straight woman in a very positive way. The things that I didn't like about this were there were times during this run that, first off, some of the terminology he used, like, we don't have to tell anybody, it could be our little secret. A lot of that is used in Predator language, let's say. And again, I'm treading very lightly, so please bear with. The fact that he was a heel, and we were supposed to accept the fact that the face wrestlers wanted to beat him up because of his lifestyle choices. That's not a heel. The heel should want to be the one that beats up the bisexual wrestler because they're bisexual, and the faces should come to his aid. Juxtapose that with Eugene, who was portrayed as a mentally challenged wrestler. However, all of the faces at the time, The Rock, John Cena, even Steve Austin, sided with Eugene and ran off the heels who were trying to take advantage of Eugene or trying to pick and bully Eugene. This is the opposite. There were times with stuff he did with SoCal Val, because this all is still in my head, I can remember this vividly, where it felt like she was being assaulted, like him putting gum from his mouth into hers when she obviously didn't want that, touching her in ways when she didn't want to be touched in those ways. And again, stuff like that he would do with the male wrestlers as well. The gimmick with him and Eric Young as a tag team, where Eric was trying to play the goofy character that didn't really know what was going on, and it kind of felt like Orlando Jordan was using him to try and get him into bed. The whole Rob Terry thing, where he would do weird stuff like squirt lotion all over his face, or have stickers with Rob Terry over his chest area. Yeah, this all was weird. And again, I'm all for bisexual characters, LBGTQ+, and if I got the acronyms wrong, I am sorry. I am all for them being on my show. I will champion Anthony Bowens every day of the week. I will champion Giselle Shaw. I will champion Nyla Rose being on my show, Sonny Kiss being on the show. I think they're all great, and I think they're all fantastic wrestlers. And I do think Orlando Jordan was a good wrestler, and he put a lot into this character. It just that the character put us in an awkward position where we basically had to root against a bisexual person just because they were bisexual. And that's not a comfortable place. And this isn't a comfortable subject So I'm going to move on. I hope I fairly explained it. I hope I didn't offend anyone. If you are, I do apologize. It's not my intent to offend you. With that being said, let's go to our number 5. Diesel and Razor Ramon. And no, not Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. The fake Diesel and the fake Razor Ramon. These were played by Glenn Jacobs and Mike Bogner, I believe was the fake Razor's name. Glenn Jacobs would go on to become Kane. This originally did not make our list, and it's another one that I scratch my head and wonder why we didn't put it on our list. Maybe because of the Kane factor. But this was just bad. The only reason that this even exists is so WWE could put a lawsuit against WCW for them using the Diesel and Razor Ramon characters as part of the invasion angle of the NWO. But this was doomed to fail from the beginning. First off, and again, no knock on Kane. I love Kane. Great wrestler. And this is strictly on his wrestling. I have to tread lightly with Kane, too, because he's very polarizing in social media. At the time, Kane was nowhere near as charismatic as Kevin Nash. And no one, I don't care who you put in the Razor Ramon character, no one was going to live up to Scott Hall. I mean, Scott Hall is all-time great. So's Nash. Don't get me wrong, Kevin. But they're just two irreplaceable characters that you tried to replace, and it was just terrible. Again, much like most of these, it didn't last too long, so we didn't have to watch it for a long time. It was just a horrible gimmick and probably should have never been done. Now, going from that, our number 4, the Renegade. In the original list, the Renegade was number 5, and again, this is right about where he should be. And this is no knock on the guy. I understand that a lot of his wrestling career weighed heavy on him and the decisions he made at the end of his life. This is a knock strictly on the gimmick he was given, which initially we were shown an ultimate weapon. A warrior was going to be brought in vignettes that was kind of clouded in smoke, and you kind of seen a guy that was built like the Ultimate Warrior, that had face paint like the Ultimate Warrior, but it really wasn't him. Much like the fake Razor and Diesel, this was just a knockoff of the Ultimate Warrior. And again, no knock on the human that played the character, it was a knock on the people that came up with it. Ultimately, they transferred him over to being more of a Native American gimmick, but by that time the damage was already done, it was already unfixable, and the Renegade never really made anything out of his wrestling career. Just an unfortunate situation. I wonder what the guy could have done if he was given something better by creative. Unfortunately, we will never know. I'll go from that, our number 3, Mantar. Initially on my old list, Mantar was number 10. Again, I have no idea how Mantar was so low on that list, because to me, when I look back and I think of really, really bad gimmicks, obviously, as you can see by his placing, Mantar is one of the worst of all time. And it's one of those things that, like, I don't know who thought this was a good idea. I mean, he's supposed to be a centaur, half man, half bull. And to make it even more ridiculous, you put this headdress that he wears out to the ring, which has to be one of the worst ring attires or walkout attires ever, that made him look even goofier. There's a possibility if you just called him Mantar and he wore the face paint that it might have caught on. I mean, think of Rhino. Rhino is a very similar thing, and that worked. And it's because they didn't put a rhino horn on the top of his head. I think there's a world where Mantar could have been worked into something good. Unfortunately, it wasn't. I just thought it was terrible. That's why it's on my list. I'll go from that, our number 2, Bastion Booger. And you may notice that a lot of these are coming from right around the same generation, the Ding Dongs, the Yeti, the Renegade, Mantar, Bastion Booger now. There was a lot of bad stuff in the early to mid-90s. Surprisingly, again, Bastion Booger wasn't initially on our original top 10, and I don't know how, because it's terrible. And the poor guy, Mike Shaw, he had a run of really bad characters. First he was Norman the Lunatic, then he was Bastion Booger, then he was Friar Ferguson. Actually, I think Friar Ferguson was before Bastion Booger. I may have them in reverse order. Man, that guy never caught a break with getting a good gimmick. This was another one, like, how did you ever expect this to work? The whole gimmick is he's gross. He wore dirty ring gear. He had food hanging off his face. He looked like he was dirty. I mean, there's a difference between someone like Bastion Booger, who's got the body hair and the food dripping off of him and dirty gear looking disgusting, and Dutch Mantell, who was dirty Dutch Mantell and kind of had that sleazy look with the body hair and everything as well, But Dutch did it different, and Dutch made it work for him. Part of Dutch's gimmick was the fact that he was so hairy and weird looking, and that's kind of what they were going with here, but I think they went a little bit too far into the Looney Tunes realm instead of into the realm of realistic wrestling. This was just bad, hence why it's on my list, hence why it's number 2. I have no idea how they didn't make the original. Now, before I get to my number 1, I do a thing here called the best of the rest. Basically, things that were considered for the list, but didn't quite make it. First of all, we get the Johnsons from TNA. And if you're not familiar with the Johnsons, they're a pair of wrestling men's reproduction parts. This, again, was another one not on the original list. And I think it may be because it was so fresh in the memory at that time. And TNA had done so many bad things that it didn't stick out as much as it does now. But this was just terrible. It was 2 guys, the Gemini or the Tolan brothers, who were wearing full body suits and masks that were flesh tone and called the Johnsons. I don't understand it now. I don't understand it then. It was shock just for shock value. I thought it was terrible, hence why I considered it for the list. But with what we have here, it wasn't quite as bad as everything that made it. The last but not least on the best of the rest, Retribution. Obviously, Retribution wasn't on the list originally because it hadn't happened yet. Retribution had a lot of great wrestlers in the group. Mustafa Ali, Mia Yim, Eric Young, Shane Thorne at some point. Even Mercedes Martinez was part of it at least once. Even Mace is better than what was portrayed here. When people talk about how bad the Dungeon of Doom is, I would watch everything the Dungeon of Doom did before I watched anything that Retribution did. That's how much worse they were, and it was so bad and so weird and gimmicky. I don't know who thought this was gonna work. You took a lot of special talented wrestlers and made them look like they were something totally goofy, which is what this ended up being, and I'm glad they're over that, and some of the wrestlers have got to go on and reinvent themselves and become better versions, hence why it was considered but didn't quite make our list. Now, before I get to my number 1, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't, and if you think I left something off the list, put something too high, something too low, let me know down here in the comments. With all that being said, our number 1 worst gimmick of all time, the Gobbledygooker. Gobbledygooker on the original list was number 4. I have to believe we did that out of respect for Hector Guerrero and no other reason other than that, because the Gobbledygooker was terrible. For weeks and weeks, we had an egg on WWF television, and the gimmick was what's going to happen on Survivor Series when the egg hatches. There were a lot of rumors at the time. One was it might be Ric Flair who was signing with the WWE. Another was that it might be Undertaker, who Undertaker's even said he thought he might be the giant egg, he thought he might be the Eggman. And just to think about it, somewhere there's an alternative reality where the Undertaker's the Eggman, and who knows what that would have done with his career and how that would have went. Here you have Hector Guerrero, who's one of the best workers of that decade and one of the great wrestlers in the fantastic Guerrero wrestling family. And you put him in a goofy kind of sports mascot gimmick that I don't think anyone that ever watched this enjoyed at all. This was just terrible for being terrible's sake. There is a point where you can watch it now and laugh at it, which I can, but unlike the Shockmaster, I haven't grown to appreciate it for that as much as I do the Shockmaster. That's why it's on my list and what I consider the worst gimmick of all time, in my opinion. Again, with all that being said, if you think I put something too high, too low, left something off the list, let me know in the comments. If you do go back and watch the original list, let me know which list you think is better. As you can see, there's a lot of changes on this. Some of it's my opinions changed, some of it's stuff that's happened in the last decade. Let me know again down here in the comments. Shout out again to Ryan Hadley for giving us a suggestion. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another Top 10.